forget your audacities need to be running.
It's running, and they can hear us.
Don't forget your audacities need to be running.
It's running, and they can hear us. Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the podcast A Surprise. Really excited to be here with no technical difficulties to start this time. Happy Friday, everyone. Like I said, today we are going to be covering a question of price. And boy, I think you're going to hear us react and be super excited. This is one of our favorite stories. But before we get into the breakdown, I would love to introduce my co-hosts today, Michal and Aziz. What's going on, Michal?
Can't complain, you know. Keep it on.
Putting on a brave face.
Very happy that we're discussing this story because it really is one of my favorites.
And Calanthe.
Pretty good. It works out really well.
I'm Crack on Kyle today. We've tried to come up with names for every pod. And then we have Aziz Sack. Can you explain that one, Aziz?
Well, I just really like the name Mouse Sack, and it's not exactly a great fit for my name, but I made it work. I'll force it. That's if you can't make it work smoothly, you just cram it in there, and yeah, that's my attitude for today. Yeah, I'm really excited about this one too. This story is so much fun. It's a explosion of ideas, and it's a lot different than some of the other ones for a lot of reasons. So, yeah, let's do it.
So for those of you who have seen the podcast A Surprise before, know that there's two versions of the podcast. The one you're watching right now, and also the awesome one on Anchor. So we have one this live with all of you awesome live people in the live chat where we do questions and stuff at the end, and also the one where we have on Anchor, which is downloadable. On today's podcast, we're going to dive into all sorts of amazing characters. Like we said, this one is not only really unique in the way that it introduces all sorts of new characters, but I think we would all agree that this is probably the most important short story connecting to the main plot points. So that's really exciting. We actually have a little bit of an announcement later, which we will get to. Yeah, before we move into the podcast, we just want to thank a few people who have supported us on Anchor. Aziz, we've had a few people throwing us some coins to the podcasters.
Yeah, thanks to Mara, Ryan B, Sam D, and James G, our first 4 Anchor supporters, and we are very grateful for that. It just gives us even more motivation to make the show everything we can do with it. That was not a very good sentence. To make the show as good as we can.
It's better that we get the crap out of the way first, I guess.
Yeah, podcast good we be making.
Podcast, nice.
Good said. Well point.
Of course, if you do want to support the podcast, you can do so by hitting the support button. $1, $5, or $10, Aziz, I believe.
Right, yep.
But if you want to support the podcast in other ways, feel free to leave us a rating or review, or like this video and subscribe. But now it's time to get into the podcast. Michal, would you like to start us off with a quote?
I would. Kings, continued Calanthe, divide people into 2 categories, those they order around and those they buy, because they adhere to the old and banal truth that everyone can be bought. Everyone. It's only a question of price.
The Honorable Ravix of Forhorn, Geralt the Witcher, is hired for a most unusual job, one he does not even understand at first, especially given he's told vaguely of a monster, but also told he will not need to carry any weapons while pretending to be the aforementioned Lord Ravix of Forhorn. On top of that, he's to sit right next to the queen herself, Calanthe, aka the Lioness of Cintra. At least he gets an explanation of the occasion itself.
Princess Pavetta is turning 15, and as is the custom, contenders for her hand have turned up in their dozens. Queen Calanthe wants her to marry someone from Skaviga. An alliance with the islanders would mean a lot to us.
Why them?
Those they're allied with aren't attacked as often as others.
A good reason. Geralt perceives that his role involves fulfilling her wish with regards to an alliance with Skellig, and assumes the queen wants him to kill one or more people. He's partly right. Kill? Yes. People? Well, let's not forget he was told a monster was involved.
The supposition that I mistake your trade for that of a hired thug has piqued me greatly. Accept, Geralt, that I belong to that select group of rulers who know exactly what witches do and how they ought to be employed. On the other hand, if someone kills as efficiently as you do, even though not for money, he shouldn't be surprised if people credit him with being a professional in that field.
She is not eager to explain the nature of this monstrous threat, but she is eager for him to obey. She reminds him of her authority and reputation, and her ability to compensate him in a generous manner. Again, it's only a question of price, but she demands a specific result. The banquet progresses, suitors and guests arrive and dine and discuss battles. The bagpipes drone, a baron named Kudkudak does a variety of incredibly accurate animal impressions, and Geralt realizes Calanthe is as formidable a personality as she is a queen. There's no court mage in Cintra, but the druid Mouthsack has come with the delegation from Skellig, and he takes particular notice of the conversation between Geralt and Calanthe. He's one of the few people who knows that Lord Forhorn is actually Geralt of Rivia, as they know each other from prior encounters and seem to be on good terms. They manage to communicate surreptitiously throughout the banquet as they slowly realize something magical is afoot. Soon enough, Princess Pavetta is presented. Many of the suitors are entranced, but Geralt is still focused on figuring out what he's meant to fight against. In addition to clarifying that she wants her daughter to marry Kraken Crate of Skellig, she hopes at least they produce a child of the quality of her suitor Ice Turseek, Kraken Crate's uncle. She informs him who the enemy is with a single word: destiny.
Your Majesty, he said quietly, not to repeat what I said earlier about killing people. You do realize that a sword alone will not defeat destiny. I do. Calanthe turned her head away. A witcher is also necessary. As you see, I took care of that.
She also reveals that his sword is within his grasp, strapped to the back of her throne. Though he still does not understand, he agrees to do her bidding. With that, she moves to speak with other guests. Mouthsack the Druid continues to seem concerned. Princess Pavetta has not raised her eyes yet throughout the night, and soon enough a message arrives for the Queen, one she is not happy to hear. A moment later.
Heavy footsteps, each accompanied by the clang of metal striking the floor, could be heard over the hum at the table. Everyone raised their heads and turned.
A man fully encased in spiked armor enters the room. He announces himself as Lord Urchion of Erlenwald. But despite it being a breach of decorum, he claims he cannot remove his helmet until midnight due to a vow. Then he recounts a most interesting tale.
15 years ago, he announced loudly, your husband, King Rognar, lost his way while hunting in Erlenwald. Wandering around the pathless tracts, he fell from his horse into a ravine and sprained his leg. He lay at the bottom of the gully and called for help, but the only answer he got was the hiss of vipers and the howling of approaching werewolves. He would have died without the help he received.
The king offered a reward for saving his life.
I asked him to promise me whatever he had left at home without knowing or expecting it. The king swore it would be so, and on his return to the castle, he found you, Calanthe, in labor. Yes, your majesty, I waited for 15 years, and the interest on my reward has grown. Today, I look at the beautiful Pavetta and see that the wait has been worth it. Gentlemen and knights, some of you have come to Cintra to ask for the princess's hand. You have come in vain. From the day of her birth, by the power of the royal oath, the beautiful Pavetta has belonged to me.
The reaction to this declaration shocks the attendees. Men like Iced, Mouthsack, and Kudkudak believe in keeping promises made and move to verify that this promise was made, while younger men like Kraken Crate and Rain Farm of Atre react with threats and aggression. Calanthe herself does not seem inclined to relent either, nor does she outright refuse. Geralt's Witcher medallion buzzes intensely, indicating the presence of magic. The princess, her bearing no longer demure, looks only at Mousesack and Geralt, the two men in the room sensitive to magic. Geralt also notices the queen give a command to a page who is so confused by the command, she appears to have to repeat it. Urchin argues his case convincingly, and Calanthe admits her husband admitted this arrangement on his deathbed. Despite this, she is intent on avoiding the marriage and continues to maneuver. Under the guise of doing what's best for the kingdom, she declines to take blame, while suggesting Lord Urchin has cruelly and deeply insulted the honor of the other knightly suitors. Ice points out that this will lead to bloodshed, and indeed, Calanthe is trying to provoke them into killing the helmeted stranger. Geralt rises and speaks, and Urchin takes it as a challenge. The feel of magic in the room grows even greater, though most remain unaware. But Geralt is not challenging Urchin. He's actually making a play to avoid bloodshed. His true identity is revealed, and he claims Urchin can't simply claim the girl. She has to agree. His credibility on such matters is boosted greatly by Mousesack, who reveals that Geralt himself is a child of surprise, and familiar both with this sort of promise and the force of destiny behind it. The chimes of midnight ring, and Calanthe reminds Lord Urchin that his vow no longer binds him. It's another stratagem. The confused page from earlier had been ordered to move the clock forward, forcing Lord Urchin to reveal his identity ahead of real midnight. Were it truly midnight, he would look like a human knight. But it is not midnight, and due to a curse, he looks quite a bit more like a hedgehog knight. Calanthe assumed that exposing him would cause her daughter to reject him, but she was wrong. Pavetta and Lord Urchin, whom she knows as Dooney, have been seeing each other for some time already. Calanthe had learned of their meetings and, of course, knew of the promise from her dying husband, hence her hiring of Geralt in advance, expecting he would slay the hedgehog creature. But as we know, Geralt would never consider a cursed human a monster. But if Pavetta simply refuses to marry him, that point is moot and no killing will be necessary. But shocking everyone, Pavetta declares she will go with Dooney and marry him. Lord Urchin, or Dooney, whatever his name is, she's in. And Geralt feels the force echo her declaration. No doubt Mousesack does as well. Calanthe, out of moves but still unwilling to lose, resorts to brute force, ordering her guards to attack. And the younger angry suitors are happy to join in, especially after the queen goaded them. As the forces of magic continue to swirl, Dooney defends himself, while a few take his side, including Kud Kudak, Iced, and most importantly, Geralt himself. Though principle is on their side, numbers are not, and they are overwhelmed. As Dooney is about to be killed, Pavetta, in grave fear for him, reveals herself as a source with a capital S. Though she herself was surely unaware she could do this, the room turns into a maelstrom with people and tables and food flying everywhere.
It's pure primordial force! The druid yelled, the racketing clatter. She's got no control over it!
The power within Pavetta is overwhelming, and at first, even Mousesack and Geralt's combined powers cannot break the spell. It's only when Kud Kudak presses on the bagpipes while making a horrendous animal noise simultaneously that Pavetta is sufficiently distracted for them to try again. This time it succeeds. The strange green magic recedes and everyone slowly begins to pick themselves up. Calanthe, after a meeting, at last relents. Having agreed to marry Iced herself, which gives her the alliance she needed through her own hand instead of her daughter's, this has the bonus side effect of breaking Dooney's curse, which apparently required him to be given a child surprise by marriage. Or just given a child surprise. Since she got the specific result she required, Calanthe rewards Geralt with her emerald necklace, and Dooney insists he must reward Geralt as well, as his life was saved by his interference and other actions. He pays it forward by claiming the law of surprise himself, and fittingly, Pavetta turns out to be pregnant, which Geralt was already pretty sure of. He wants this child of hers to be a Witcher. Though the demands of destiny have just been fulfilled, new demands have been established. Geralt is now tied to this unborn child by those very same forces. The question of price turned out to have a shockingly high, costly answer.
So that was our synopsis, and now we're going to get into our reactions. But before we do our reactions, which we're just gonna gush about this chapter. You're gonna see raw, unfiltered just love for this short story. We have a couple of donations from Morley, I believe, and she's just showering us with love as she usually does, and the support and love that you show for not only myself, Mora, but Aziz, Michal, and all of the YouTube community. Thank you so much. I say that on behalf of everyone, so we appreciate you. I know that you can't be here right now, but we want to make sure that you get that shut up because we love you. And then we have Emily Hall. Aziz, can you read this one? You got it?
Yeah. She says, can't stay long, but wanted to toss a coin first time because I absolutely love this podcast. Much love and respect for Michal, Aziz, and Kyle. Thanks, Emily. Appreciate that.
So we appreciate all the coins and support that you're tossing to us. Let's get into reactions because this is really, we often differ on opinion. We had a couple of different episodes. Michal said, a grain of truth with Nivellen wasn't her favorite one, but we're all in agreement. Behind the scenes, we have our own little private conversations before we get into the podcast. We have multiple discussions about what we're going to talk about. And now we're kind of almost all on the same page being this is maybe the best short story. And it's relevant too because it connects to the main plot point. Obviously Pavetta is Ciri's mom, which is super important. And then there's the whole Dooney bit, which we're going to discuss in another episode. But I just found this short story so funny because you got Calanthe and she's like, I am queen, fuck the law, surprise. And then you got the old Skelligans and they're like, the law, surprise is sacred. Then you got the young Skelligans who are going no, dude, fuck the law, surprise. I'm marrying Pavetta. And then you have Geralt. He's like, I think Dooney here, Urcheon of Erlenwald, destiny is kind of a thing, even though I hate destiny. So there's all these conflict. There's 7 different viewpoints on the law, surprise, and how things go down. We got a whole funny moment section later. A guy takes a friggin' knife out of a lamb after he finds out that Pavetta, he won't be marrying Pavetta and he wants to stab people. And, we talked about privately, we'll talk about this too, just the descriptiveness of the chapter is very Martin-esque. Sapkowski is his own author, but we felt like this was kind of a Feast for Crows chapter, the descriptiveness of the food and the location and all that. So it was just overall a really great chapter. It has relevant, recurring themes, love across borders and destiny and things that we're going to talk about. But overall, I really, really love this one. I went back and read it a third time before the podcast today. And I got to say 10 out of 10 for this short story for me. What about you guys?
I love this story. We had a poll in our Facebook group, I think a while back, about, it might have actually been yesterday, but time has no meaning anymore. So it was some time ago where, people were like, what's your favorite short story? And A Question of Price was somehow not winning. And I commented hello, it's obviously A Question of Price. And I might have pulled ahead. I love this story. This is to me, Sapkowski at his curious and funny and portentous best. And it really, we said of the first story, The Witcher, that it really builds a world in a very incredible way. And this story builds the politics and the characters in, I think, the same and very effective way. Again, it's hilarious. And I think it's one of those great stories because every time you read it, you find something a little bit new. I had not at all picked up on Calanthe moving the time of the midnight bell, with the page, see it right there, and it's so delightful to find these little things. The first time
Geralt shaking like a dog after he gets out of the bath.
Exactly. The first time I read this, I was really I've been reading through the books and the stories in this volume, and I wasn't particularly impressed from a feminist point of view. As I've expressed, there are definitely things to see there, but there are also a lot of disappointments. And then Calanthe just storms onto the scene And I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe these words are coming out of your mouth. And it was just like a complete reversal of expectation. And, you know, like nothing's perfect. I still have critiques, and I'll have critiques of later stories in the book. But I think this is a real, like a step forward for the whole series, and really establishing what Sapkowski is capable of as a short story writer and as a you know, deep, long, epic books, you know, ahead of time, planter of ideas as well.
Right on. As far as my takes, I'm a similar attitude about it. I love the story. I've read it several times, and just like both of y'all said, every time you read it, you find something new. And I mean, I found something new at like 4 a.m. last night that I was like super excited to add to the notes. So I'm sure that'll probably happen again in like a week. Be like, oh man, I missed something else. But that's the nature of stories that have great detail and a lot of depth to them. And also to sort of echo what y'all said is already maybe with adding a little bit to it, is that if you add up everything in the prior stories as far as the story going forward, well, there's a lot of world building and character building for Geralt, things like that are certainly extremely relevant from the prior stories. But this is like a fire hose of characters that matter later compared to what was there before. There's so many of these characters that return. There's backstories with a lot of these characters that get explored. So not only is it a fantastic story on its own, but the more you get into the Witcher world, the more you appreciate how much this story matters. And I think that causes it to grow in esteem even more once you get through the series. Because I think all of us liked it the first time through, but after finishing the books, it just looks even stronger. I mean, when you come back to it, it's like, wow, this was set up really well. And these characters have this nice consistency, and these themes are carried forward. And yeah, it is true that one could just sit here and gush for quite a while about this story. And it is true as well that it's certainly the one, as Kyle said, that we're the most in agreement on. Not that we've really disagreed much, but this one we just,
Well,
we were all just like, oh, we love this story, right? Right? Okay, cool. Yeah.
We got to have our patented Michal rant section. We're going to have a couple of those. But you know what it kind of felt like to me too, and just kind of going into the plot, Aziz, we have this in the document here. It's like the supernatural elements and the magic. Like we all love A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones. It's kind of like when you first start getting those old gods, White Walker bits, and you start just getting into the magic of Game of Thrones and seeing that potential. And we're just starting to see that potential now, right? And it has such a strong connection because like all the other characters that we talked about, like we don't see Nivellen again, or we don't see Renfrey again, but Mousak and Calanthe and Iced, even though we saw some of these characters die, their legacies still live on with other characters and stories and stuff like that. So that's why this particular short story is so great in the way that Sapkowski pulled it off, because it is a short story, but it's also connected to the main plot, and it has relevance that goes right into the last book. But by the way,
in my opinion, this is chapter 1 of The Witcher, really.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
So I guess we'll do a little bit of an announcement before we truly get into stuff. So for those of you who have read into the books, there are some spoilers, and there are events that happen later on connected to this specific short story. So
one or two.
Yeah, one or two. We're talking like big stuff. I'm not going to give any hints just in case, because there's like 75% of the people that are getting into The Witcher are new readers and stuff like that. So we want to make sure that we're not spoiling anyone. However, we have had a discussion privately and both on the Podcast of Surprise Facebook group. We did a little poll, and we're going to do another episode next week. So thank you to Michal and Aziz for making some time next week. We haven't decided on a time yet. We know some of you work during the day. Me and Aziz and Michal are maybe discussing it, doing a little bit later. But we're gonna do a spoiler episode and talk about like meta stuff, like the Azor Ahype stuff, just like really, really big stuff connected to Pavetta, Ciri, and stuff that even goes into the last book, because we want to discuss some of it in this podcast, but then we realized it might be kind of problematic because we don't want to have any first-time readers or listeners spoiled. So
we're keeping it nice and separate. So people who want the spoiler talk, we'll be here for you next week. We'll announce the time, But for this one, we'll keep it. We'll maybe tease that there is more to some of these stories, but we won't go into detail.
Yeah.
But you guys have been asking for an extra episode, so another one next week. Hell yeah.
Yeah. So should we explain a little bit about the story itself? The story has a few, like you said, like we indicated with our gushing, there's something new to notice every time, and part of those are plot elements. So I thought maybe it would be good to do a minute on explanations of what exactly was happening with all this intrigue, in case some people might have missed or misunderstood.
And also, we also got a section on the law surprise. We'll definitely go into that too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You want to start, Michal or Aziz?
Aziz can take this one. I'll do the.
All right.
Cool. So what I wrote here was the level of intrigue and implied backstory, let alone the supernatural elements, which always create an element of mystery, means some explanations are in order. For example, some people would want to know, why does Geralt step in to defend Urchin, and ditto Eisten Kudkudak? And I think it's pretty straightforward. They're guys who are very honorable, and they believe that this promise was made, and this queen is reneging on her promise, and it's a really big deal when a person of authority doesn't follow through on a promise. Kudkudak has a really excellent line about, they're talking about fairy tales and legends, and he says the most legendary thing of all was the time when kings and queens would keep their word. It's a really great own that Calanthe has to kind of reckon with as she's confronted with it. And but guys like Geralt and Eisten Kudkudak are, men of honor, I guess you could say. So is that how you guys saw it, or is this just my opinion? Or
Aziz, I'm going to jump in on that because we talked a lot about Cersei behind the scenes, and I think that we could we are going to do a comparative episode, by the way, at some point. But it kind of reminded me of Cersei ripping up the paper, right?
Oh,
you know what I
mean?
And her moment in the show where she says to Peter Baelish, "Power is power." She's just like, "Fuck it, I'm here. I am the queen." So Michal, I'll throw it to you because I know you have some queen shit to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I really love the idea that like the politics and the magic intertwine so like almost inseparably, and I think that's really part of why some of the stuff that happens is complicated because Geralt is not really interested in the politics, right? Like the whole story. This is, again, kind of one of those stories where Geralt meets someone new or newish to him, and they're like, Geralt, let me tell you everything. And I think that from his point of view, it can be complicated to see why, some people behave the way they do. But I think that, I think Ace is definitely driven by, Ace is like the only good man in this chapter.
I've just been waiting for you to go in and crack on Creighton the other masters.
As a general rule, the men in this chapter are disappointing.
Can you explain why? Is it because she's 15?
Yes. Well, that's a big part of it. I'm not going to lie. And I get okay, so some of the suitors, we don't know how old Kroch is, but I guess he's probably a teenager. He seems...
He's already got a wife and kids.
Kroch, really?
Yeah, she was going to be his second wife.
Oh, no, never mind. Forget that.
That makes it even worse, which is awesome.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, they were... Okay. Apparently they allow that on Skellige. I'm not sure. It's not... The law isn't really well defined, but they're like, he's already got a wife back home.
Salt wife? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, princess. Yeah, but I think, it definitely is like the, an emphasis on she's turning 15 and we need to see her married off. And then you find out she's pregnant already.
And Dooney's been
courting her for a year.
13. She was 13.
Yeah.
There's a lot of not great here. A lot of not great.
What were people thinking in medieval times? Well, this
isn't really reflective. Women didn't get married as young. But I do think that, in contrast with that, also Kudkudak, turns out to be, a pretty decent guy, but, the way he's introduced, which is my wife's gonna die so I can marry this hot little chick, It's I'm not into that.
And then Calanthe is like, maybe you should take care of your wife. feed her a little bit more, fatten her up, and maybe, and I thought that was such a great takedown.
Yeah,
Calanthe's like, no, I'm not letting you near my daughter.
Yeah, which is funny because she actually asks Ace if he's there to court Pavetta, and he's like, "Lady, no,
He's
you know what I'm here for."
She can't fulfill my needs.
So Ace is pretty great. He's one of the people who definitely has like a handle on the situation and is kind of keeping his compass pointed at the North Star. That's not a sex reference. It's just an unfortunate coincidence. So yeah, I mean, as a general rule, not super impressed. But there are definitely some points of illumination and light along the way.
Aziz, you had a cool reference to Iced, like the inversion of the evil stepmother trope.
Yeah. We're later in the episode. We're going to go deeper into the influences, and that's not just a common trope in fairy tales, but especially in the story of Cinderella, which is a major influence here. And the evil stepmother trope is so common that if you really look at Iced as the inversion of that, as the good stepfather, it's a dead ringer, dead center hit, whether, TV version, book version. He's just a really good person, and he treats everyone. He seems to treat everyone well. He treats, he upholds traditions and the upright parts of traditions. He's honest and brave, and yeah, he's almost over the top how good he is, and that's on purpose because he's supposed to be the inversion of the evil stepmother trope. So evil stepmothers are in these stories are often quite over the top themselves, so he has to keep pace.
And Calanthe just being the evil mother.
Yeah. So we have the idea of her as a political operator is super interesting. Like Michal said, there's the combination of politics and supernatural and culture and everything, and just this scene. And there's a quote here that sums it up pretty well. That sums up Calanthe's notion for what she wants out of all this, and also describes the political situation pretty well. I think it's a very efficient little quote here.
The in Cintra quote, right?
Yeah.
Okay. In Cintra, women can't rule. King Rognar died some time ago, and the queen doesn't want another husband. Our Lady Calanthe is wise and just, but a king is a king. Whoever marries the princess will sit on the throne, and we want a tough, decent fellow. They have to be found on the islands. They're a hard nation.
Yeah, because they want a tough, strong king, which you can see why they would. Calanthe has managed to subvert that against them. She has to basically marry a man and let him sit on the throne. But if the man isn't worthy, she doesn't have to marry him. So she's kind of used that exception to hold on to power by simply not getting married. Before the story, something we'll talk about later in another episode when we get into more detail on her and just the Cintra and history, things like that. There are some things she did as a child that maybe turned off other suitors, reputation-wise, even though she's beautiful and powerful and strong, that curbed some of the marriage opportunities for her, which you wonder if that was intentional, because she didn't want to marry certain people. And by eliminating certain people from contention, she was able to keep power even longer because she was able to delay getting married and just continue to delay. And finally, she married Rognar. And, well, there is some significant evidence that not only Rognar tried to kill Calanthe, but Calanthe tried to kill Rognar. And for all we know, this time that Rognar got injured in this hunting accident may have even been Calanthe's doing.
Hunting accident, you say? Can you say Robert Baratheon?
Yup. Hello, more parallels. And
honestly,
again,
I love Calanthe. I would not want to be married.
I'm sorry,
to her.
guys. It's going to happen all episode with me today on the Cersei Robert stuff.
That's all right. So, and by the way, y'all, if it's not clear, we should point out, since we're comparing Cersei to Calanthe, that it's so eerie how similar they are without it being very likely that either influenced the other. Because this story was written in 1991. So certainly before Cersei even existed. So George clearly, Sapkowski clearly didn't get it from Game of Thrones. And George R. Martin probably didn't get it from The Witcher either, because George R. Martin doesn't read Polish as far as I know. And this wasn't translated until the 2000s. So he had already written Cersei before. So anyway, that's pretty darn cool. But so she by a combination of pointing out the weaknesses in her suitors and by delaying and by turning off other suitors, she's managed to hold on to power. So it touches into one of the main themes of this story, which is misdirection. Misdirection both from the narrative and from the characters and from expectations. Just a lot of misdirection. You're constantly thinking one thing only to find out it's another, whether it's what time it really is, whether it's who's who, or whether it's Calanthe's intentions, or whether it's something like this where it's like the first line of the book or of the story, which is a knife was at the Witcher's throat. And it's like, oh, he's getting a shave. That sets the tone for the whole story, is those kind of tricks like that. And that's part of what makes it so great to reread, is you get to
it's crazy because Calanthe is not your average queen, right? We think of a queen and we think feminine, and she's very aggressive and strong-headed in her thoughts. And we see her play the game. Like, look at her shut down Kudkadak, and then let Ice kind of wiggle his way in there. She's playing the game, and she's smart. You know what I mean? She's observing everything from her place in the throne room when the feast is going down, and kind of just seeing things unfold, seeing what maybe a suitor may emerge, even though she had kind of already had this thing pre-planned with Skellige, because, she wants to use their navy and use that to her advantage so they don't get their shipments attacked as much and all of these other things. And so I just think Calanthe is such an interesting character, and she's really the driving force behind the chapter, or a big part of it.
One other thing about Cintran politics that's important and to understand, especially if your mind is rooted in other fantasy stories like, say, Game of Thrones, since we keep bringing it up, the monarchy system is different here in that it's more of a later monarchy period, where the farther you go in human history, especially European, let's keep focused on European history, because obviously it changes when you go from location to location. But generally speaking, monarchy, no matter where it began, lost power over the centuries. The monarchs very slowly lost absolute power, and eventually they started having things like parliaments and councils and things like that they were answerable to. That's certainly the case here. Calanthe is basically being forced. This event of Pavetta's hand is something that she was sort of forced politically into. If she had it her way, she would have probably delayed even longer. But it goes to show the power level. She's not an absolute power monarch. She's not super, super powerful. But if she marries Ice Tursik or has the alliance of the Skelligans, which she does get, it does effectively make her more powerful, because she has military backing behind her authority, and like big military backing in this case. So that's part of why she really wants this particular service that she wants from Geralt. She wants this result one way or another, because that's how important it is.
Which kind of ties into one of our main themes in our craft section here, which is consent, right? Like we see her like yes, it's a great move for her to go with Ice, but it's also a consensual thing. Pavetta has a lot less until the whole Urcheon Dooney thing happens, right? So, Michal, I saw you have a couple of points in here. Do you want to kind of start on that?
Yeah, well, I think consent is a really important idea. We've talked about it before in the stories, but we are kind of talking about a woman in terms of Calanthe who, doesn't really care for the consent of others. Like, I think she's very, because, and this, we can talk about this more later if we want, but like, what does a woman who wants to be queen, who should technically be queen, but because of the laws can't rule on her own, like, you can understand how someone like that would use every scrap of power, and would nullify the consent of other people. I mean, she's just bossing people around the whole story. Her daughter. Yeah. Absolutely. And like, and the fact that she has to concede to the idea that like, oh, well, Princess Pavetta has to get married. And she's like, well, okay, so let me maneuver this so that I get the exact outcome that I want. At the same time, though, Calanthe's consent turns out to be less important than Pavetta's, because, as when I was reading this the first time, I was like, oh my God, how could we just have this magic system where like a girl is just like promised to a man and like magically, and that's destiny, and that's supposed to be a good thing. And then Geralt comes in clutch and he's like, aha, only if she agrees. And I'm like, yes, okay, cool. So yeah, and that consent is actually what kind of takes precedence. And then sort of Calanthe's concession to that consent in allowing. I mean, let's get real. Like, she probably didn't really have a choice, but like in I guess finding it in herself to permit it, because I do think she is genuine at the end. That is what frees Dooney of the curse. So you have a lot of kind of control, and consent is a really interesting issue in the story, and a theme also. Sorry. Through her conversation with Geralt, because it's kind of like, well, if I pay you, does that mean that you have consented to this thing that I'm asking or telling you to do? And
yes.
there's a lot of kind of the idea of money as it plays into consent is really important, because it is a question of price in the end, right?
It also connects to our theme, love across borders, that we spoke about in the Nivellen chapter, right? We see Nivellen as this beast, and we have Verena, and there's this odd relationship going there. But, I mean, clearly, Pavetta fell in love with Dooney despite all of these things. And this kind of ties in with the law of surprise and the whole consent argument that you're making, Michal. So that's...
Right. I mean, right.
The idea of true love the idea of true love breaking a curse. True love.
Yeah, and like, is Pavetta, I mean, she feels that she has consented, but with the idea of destiny in this, and the idea of kind of, let's just say big mysterious forces at work, we kind of do have to wonder how much of her consent is her own, as opposed to, and that is something that Ciri will grapple with a lot, about her destiny versus her own will, and how they go hand in hand. I don't think Sapkowski ever answers this question, which is probably a good thing, because I don't think it has an answer, but it's really interesting to see how he grapples with it. Not mostly, but a lot through female characters.
Well said. I have one other thing to add real quick with that, just to point out that I don't know whether it's interesting to just kind of like politics and the supernatural being combined. It's hard to describe the curse theme, which has been in every single story so far. We had a curse in the first book, or in the first story with the Striga curse. The second story, obviously, Nivellen is cursed. The third story, Renfrey might be cursed, but there's certainly the curse of the Black Sun, blah, blah, blah. Then this story, blatant example of a curse again. But also the idea gets a little inverted, or at least discussed differently. It's both a supernatural idea, and it's a destiny idea, and it's just a recurring theme, as far as something that Sapkowski seems to like to put as a big part of his world, make prominent. But what exactly is a curse outside of the magical element? For example, can destiny be a curse? I guess is my question. For example, from Calanthe's point of view, knowing this child surprise promise was coming due could probably be viewed as a curse on her progeny. Like, she could probably see it that way. Maybe not technically a curse, but in terms of how she perceives it, it's basically the same thing. It's like this awful thing that she can't get around, that's got a magical bearing to it.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like the idea of like the mechanism that would break the curse is also laying the curse on Calanthe/Pavetta.
This is really interesting, too, because we were talking about this privately. How many times destiny has been referenced before this chapter in short story? And it is only twice. And this time it's capitalized with a D. And that's a pretty big deal, right? Like, as far as like when an author does that, it's a signal that this is going to be important later on. There's going to be some sort of payoff, right? And I think that that's something that we have to pay attention to, especially since Ciri is the child of surprise. And then, the whole law of surprise thing with Geralt, we see that his life has been affected by the same thing. So there's this cycle of things happening that are all connected that Sapkowski is laying out with destiny. And for him to capitalize, it may seem like a small thing, but it's kind of like the Melisandre capitalization of snow we see. I'm referencing Game of Thrones again, but kind of like that.
Who could it be referring to?
Who could it be referring to? Ramsay Snow? Haha. Sorry.
I really do. I love the way the politics versus magic plays into that because, we have this idea that Calanthe, she has this great quote where Geralt's like, you're asking for the near impossible. She's like, dude, if it was nearly impossible, I'd do it myself. So there's this idea that like she really is going toe to toe with against law, against natural law. And that idea is reflected when when she tries to reject this idea of destiny, and all the men around her are like, oh, whoa, you're literally breaking our social contract right here, and like if that breaks, then we have no guarantee of your behavior, and you have no guarantee of ours. And so this idea of destiny as both like a very practical, like a law of nature, and as a magical one, is something that I think plays really powerfully through the chapter.
And that's why there's so much aggression. Like you said, that was really well said, Michal, because the older Skelligans, they understand the importance of maintaining this sense of honor and justice and truth, because it affects all of society, where the younger Skelligans are just concerned about their own honor and their own what they can get. And that is maybe a little tropey to have only the older guys do that and the younger guys go one way, but it's also pretty normal, and that's realistic. So I don't have a problem with that. I think it's really well explained. And of course, someone like Geralt and Mousak, those guys are even older. And Calanthe is not old. I mean, she's like 34, I think, in this story, something like that. So that's fairly young for a ruler, and especially one who's already been in power 20 years. So yeah, she's not young in the sense of inexperience, but she's not old in terms of having had a full life span.
Michal,
to be fair, most of the young characters in the story are not that well developed. Pavetta is also kind of just like, well, she's got green eyes and magic.
Yeah.
One interesting thing that you mentioned, Michal, was contracts. We have Calanthe trying to push one thing onto Geralt, and he's like, listen, like, this is not the code of the Witcher. And we've kind of talked about this in previous episodes, like the code of ethics of the Witcher. The Witcher's trying to stay out of all things political and magic. And it's so interesting that we have the point of view of Geralt, because he accepts this is like, this is kind of an important thing. Look at how many people are respecting the law of surprise, right? And he's like, I'm not here to have you push your destiny on me, what you think your destiny is. He's like, that's not what I'm for hire for. And he still gets pulled into it regardless. So it's like, wow, is this like really part of Geralt's destiny? Like, he still ends up in this situation where, he makes this contract for Ciri, So I find that really interesting, the perspective of Geralt and the whole situation, because we kind of have the dueling perspectives of Calanthe, who's really trying to push her agenda. And then Geralt's like, listen, you can't just push all of this stuff on people because you have power. And we see it backfire in her face, right? Because Pavetta just says yes right away. So it's really interesting to see all the different perspectives on destiny and social contracts and all that kind of stuff, the law of surprise in this chapter. There's really a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah, and I think Geralt, going back to why he sticks around in the first place, I do think he feels the pull of destiny. And I think he has some sense that something is up, because right from the beginning, it's like, you don't have to stay here. Like, yeah, they took your swords, but like, you're definitely stronger than this guy, than Haxo. Like, you could leave if you wanted to leave. And, again, just like the exterminator versus assassin thing that we were talking about, or policeman thing that we were talking about in the last episode, Calanthe is like, oh, I'm going to use you as both, like it fits, it's fine. Like, I know it totally tracks. And Geralt never, like, he agrees, but he doesn't ever really like agree. And he's just kind of, I really do think that that's why when shit goes down, he's like, okay, this is why I'm here.
It's kind of like when you have a conversation with someone and you just have to nod in agreement, like you don't, like you just have to sit there and listen. That's kind of how it felt like it was for Geralt a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, say yes, and I will pay you, and this will be awesome, or I'll torture you to death.
His options are limited.
That's so good. Yeah. So it's neat too. A little bit more about curses, as far as the recurring theme and such. another, like you mentioned it, Kyle, the true love thing, the unlovable but must find love, maybe would be another way to put it, or a similar way to put it, because that's certainly what like the priestess of the lion-headed spider thought, that turning Nivellen into a bear creature would mean no one would ever love him, and similar to the spell put on Dooney here, who's going to love a hedgehog man. So that certainly seems to tie in. Yeah, Hedge Knight would.
Hedge Knight, sorry. I had to.
Dooneykin the Tall.
Oh my god. I just got your joke 3 seconds later. Duncan the Tall. Okay.
And so Calanthe tried really hard to avert destiny. And in attempting to do so, she basically reset the whole thing. She got around. She didn't actually escape this child of surprise promise, but in trying to, a new one was put on her grandchild instead. So it's another situation. It's kind of like Lesser Evil, where if Geralt had just done nothing, things might have gone a lot better. Ditto Calanthe here. By trying to battle destiny, she just made her own problems worse, got more wrapped into destiny. But on the other hand, that's looking at things with hindsight. And it would also be really out of character for Calanthe or Geralt to just do nothing. Just sit back and just let it play out. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why I love Calanthe, because, I disagree with a lot of what she does, and I do not think she's a good person. And there are some things that happen later that I'm just like, holy shit, you're really not a good person. But I think you understand where she's coming from always. And you get why she's been driven to do a lot of the things, not everything maybe, but a lot of the things that she does. And so that doesn't make her good. It just makes her like an understandable, a character, rather than just like...
She's trying to survive, right? A lot like Cersei. Yeah. That's why the Cersei vibes are so big for me. Like, people are like, why can't you...
Yeah, but Calanthe's smart.
Yeah,
so.
Calanthe's smart. People are like, why can't you empathize with Cersei? I'm like, because she's a bad person. You know what I mean? That's what it really boils down to for me. But Calanthe is, like, her moves are more calculated. But we won't get into that. That's for a whole nother episode. We will discuss that.
Yeah, should we talk about influences? I think the fairy tale influences are so powerful that explaining that before we break down the characters really sets a lot up. So sometimes we do the influences later in the episode, but this is a time where I think it'll work better to do more towards this front half. We're moving into the second half here, but whatever.
Should I read the weird synopsis of Hans my Hedgehog?
Yes, please. And first, let's remind people that the word urchin is an old English / medieval word that literally means hedgehog. So there you go. That's pretty straightforward. So yes, each of us has a short story or a major influence we're going to discuss from that we're going to take the lead on. Kyle's going to start with Hans my Hedgehog, which honestly I had not even heard of before this.
The Grimm fairy tales, if anybody have heard of
those. Okay. Yeah, I guess that one escaped my notice. I've certainly heard of Grimm. Everyone's heard of Cinderella, and everyone's heard of the Arthurian stuff, which is what the other two bits are. But so Kyle, you're going to lead us into this lesser known fairy tale saga or story.
And it was brought up by, I believe, Ludmila, I believe is her name.
Oh, cool.
And a couple of other people who are our European friends who have brought this up. I actually didn't know that much about this story personally. I've read it a couple times. I'm still learning more about it. But I had mentioned Beauty and the Beast, but I think that this applies a little bit more. So Aziz is going to talk a little bit about Cinderella, and then Michal has some absolute gasoline to pour in the fire with some Arthurian legends.
Cool.
So I'm just going to read. I'm not the best reader, but here we go. A wealthy but childless farmer wishes he had a child, even a hedgehog. He comes home to find that his wife has given birth to a baby boy that is a hedgehog from the waist up. They name him Hans my Hedgehog. It's really hard to get through this without laughing. After 8 years, Hans leaves his family riding a shod cockerel, which is a cock rooster, to seek his fortune. He goes off into the woods and watches over his donkeys and pigs. So that's kind of funny because we see all the different people acting like animals in this chapter, so that's pretty funny. A few years later, a lost king stumbles upon Hans after hearing him play beautifully on the bagpipes, which we hear Kutkadek. And is it Cookadack that does it?
No, Drogdar, Dragbon Drew.
Yeah, Drogdar Drambon Drew. Hans makes a deal with the king. He will show him the way home if the king promises to sign over whatever first comes to meet him upon his return. So we have the Ragnar Law of Surprise connection. Remember, Ragnar needed the help from Duny, so that's the connection there. However, the king thinks Hans is illiterate and decides to trick him by writing an order that Hans should receive nothing. So this is kind of a little twist with Calanthe where she's going to try to, backstab Duny, even though she knows that there was agreement. Calanthe kind of misleads everyone, invites everyone to the banquet, even though she knew about this before. Then they arrive at the kingdom. The king's daughter runs to greet him. So we have Pavetta and the Duny connection. Previously, no one knows that they've had a relationship, and then it's revealed that they've been seeing each other for a while. And then the king tells her about the deal Hans tried to make and how he has tricked him. Unconcerned by the betrayal, Hans continues to tend to his animals in the forest. So a little bit of a change there, not an exact one-for-one comparison.
That's cool.
So a second Lost King stumbles upon Hans and agrees to his deal. Upon his return, the second king's only daughter rushes out to greet him, and in doing so becomes the property of Hans. For the sake of her father, the princess happily agrees to Hans's deal. So there's a little bit more that goes on here, but if you can see the similarity with the Law of Surprise, the betrothal and all that. So this is based off the Brothers Grimm fairy tale. If y'all want to go check it out, I believe it's from 1815. It first started, but there's many variations of this. But yeah, so this is the fairy tale that Sapkowski that used kind of as the main construct for all the Duny stuff, the Urcheon of Erlenwald, the Pavetta, Law of Surprise stuff, and that's where that comes from.
Right on. Let me correct myself real quick, or make sure it was clear. Drogadar is the court lutist at Cintra. Dragbon Du is the skald from Skellige, and he's the bagpiper. So just not
and then
that important.
Kukudak is like, ooh, I like that sound.
Yes, that's really good, Kyle. That's really the Hans.
But
my
by the way,
completely new to me.
Hans removes his hedgehog skin at one point. It's like, I'm just gonna remove my skin. And it's so weird.
Do that?
Yeah, you guys will have to go read the story for your own interpretation of that. Yeah. But it's kind of weird. This is really a weird story.
That's great. I'd never heard of that before.
It's so typical of fairy tales, especially old ones, where they're just like humming along, kind of like very like mild and childlike, and all of a sudden something horrific like that happens, like someone's entire skin is pulled off or something like that, which is also true of Cinderella, as we'll see in a minute. Are we ready for Cinderella, or is there anyone else have anything to say about Hans the Hedgehog?
So what do you guys think about the story? Like the parallels are pretty crazy. It's like almost a one-for-one, but he makes, Sapkowski always inverts. Like we've talked about how he inverts fairy tales in previous podcasts, Aziz. So there's a few changes, but it's like pretty close to a one-for-one. Like, a few minor changes, but he kind of just inserts it in there. There's so much else going on, though, within the chapter, obviously, because this is Sapkowski's Witcher story, and it's not Hans my Hedgehog. So it is kind of difficult to follow because there's all sorts of other tertiary characters that we see that are influencing the actual Witcher story.
Odds that Sapkowski had read Hans my Hedgehog as a child, or at least some point in his life, very, very high.
I think so, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I had no idea. I was just like, oh, this one is not based off of
it's actually
I guess it is.
It's actually a German tale told by Dorothea Wieman, if I'm saying that correctly. So it's German, so close to Poland.
Cool. Nice. Yeah. Does it have did you find a date on that or a rough dating on that at all?
It's 1815. It was was published in the Second Brothers Grimm called Kinder und Hausmärchen, Volume 2. So there's like this volume of short stories. Which is,
cool.
And so the Brothers Grimm is a bunch of different stories, which is funny enough. The Last Wish is a bunch of different short stories. So a lot of different similarities there. And Sapkowski definitely took big influence from this story.
Very cool. Okay. Cinderella. Let's do Cinderella. There's obvious. That's a little more of an obvious reference here. There's a very straightforward one. We'll start off with this quote, Michal, if you would.
Yes, absolutely. Last winter, Prince...
Well, we at least have one of these. I love it.
We stumped her. Hrobarik. Hrobarik? I don't know how to say that.
Trobrick,
Cool,
I don't know.
Poor Michal. She has to do voices. She has to do analysis. She's got like 4 jobs.
Last winter, Prince Trobrick, not being so gracious, tried to hire me to find a beauty who, sick of his vulgar advances, had fled the ball, losing a slipper. It was difficult to convince him that he needed a huntsman and not a witcher.
So, of course, the slipper is a recurring theme of Cinderella, but backing it up, Cinderella is way, way, way older as a story than most of the fairy tale references / legends that we've reported on / that Sapkowski has shown his influences on. Of course, we don't know everything he's been influenced by, and I'm sure there's references we missed, especially things that are more outside of, Americans' knowledge and Canadian knowledge, because we'll miss some Polish references, for example. But for example, the Hans my Hedgehog, you said was like 1815. Mm-hmm. Michal's going to talk about Arthurian stuff, which goes back to pretty far, 500 AD, 600 AD. But, Dracula only goes back, to the 1800s. And what are the other, what am I forgetting? Snow White is also like 17th century. So, but Cinderella goes back so far that we don't even know how old it is. It was reported on by the Greek geographer Strabo around the turn of the millennium. So around the time of when BC switched to AD, it was already an established story called Rhodopis. This character Rhodopis was a slave woman that grew to marry the Pharaoh of Egypt. And well, that's very much when you hear of the term Cinderella story, which gets thrown around and from everything from sports to, stories like this, the idea is you go from the most humble beginnings to a royalty or to the top, or from a loser to a winner. That's more of the sports metaphor there. We're going from like the last place to first place. But there's versions, literally thousands, not exaggerating, thousands of versions of the Cinderella story. Unlike, again, these other references, like Hans my Hedgehog is German. There's not versions of that told elsewhere around the world, as far as I know, at least not many. Ditto Snow White. That story's been told in other ways, but it's mostly a European thing. Cinderella, I couldn't find any examples in Africa, but it exists in all over Europe, all over Asia, all over the Middle East. There's 1001. The Arabian Nights tales have a Cinderella version. There's a Chinese version called Yi Zhan that was written in 860 AD.
Oh yeah,
there's
that one
Maltese
is really cool.
Version.
That one is.
Yeah,
really
I'll
cool.
describe it. Actually, I should briefly describe that one. It's wacky. There's a Persian version. There's an Arabic version. So there's recurring themes are talking animals, the footwear thing, finding the person whose shoe the shoe fits. Greatness gone unnoticed or undetected, and of course the evil stepmother / evil sisters, and the fairy godmother is also that was more of a later addition to the story, but it's become ubiquitous in later tellings. And we'll get back to the fairy godmother part because that pops up in a few different places. But yeah, the Chinese version Yi Zhan is funny. It's you have this woman whose mother was killed by her evil stepmother, and the woman is reincarnated as a fish, and the girl talks to the fish constantly and gets advice from it. Eventually the evil stepmother kills the fish, but the bones have magic in them, and the bones grant the girl these special shoes and garments of appropriate nature. And it ends the same with the king, like going on a quest to find whose shoe that was, etc. So this is an extremely old story with many different versions. You can see all these elements.
Tell us
in this
about
story.
The ending, Aziz. Don't skimp on it.
Oh yeah, so I forgot. Yeah, you're right. The ending of that story is that it's very random. The princess marries this king, but then flying fish kill the stepmother and sisters. They just flying fish just come out of nowhere and kill the evil stepmother. Like, well, okay.
when Aziz told Michal and me this in our private chat on Tuesday, I was just like, we couldn't stop laughing for like 3 or 4 minutes. We were like, what? Flying fish are murderers? Just such a weird ending. You know what I mean? I was like, okay. Like, yeah. Aziz is telling us this great story. I thought it's ending. And he's like, oh, guys, guess what happens at the end?
flying fish kill the stone. Oh, it's just one line, in the synopsis. Like, oh, really? Where were those flying fish before? They just entered the story out of nowhere. I don't quite understand. But so you can see these recurring elements. The fairy godmother element is a little obscure in this version of the story in A Question of Price, because there's no direct fairy godmother, but there is this power within Pavetta that comes from elven magic, basically, and that's sort of a fairy influence. So it's almost like she inherited these powers from her descendants, and it's sort of like the similar concept. Also, the idea of being helped, getting advice from being helped by her own mother. It's been inverted. Instead of her mother helping her, Pavetta's being stopped by her mother, but of course it doesn't work. So really, there's just a ton on Cinderella here. It's possibly the biggest of the influences, but that's a matter of opinion. I just love this pattern.
Hey Aziz, Mandy says in the chat that ending seems kind of fishy to me.
Oh, and there is some fish in this story too, isn't there? What was that reference? A fish just flies. Didn't it smack Geralt in the chest or something?
That's in our funniest moments section. Right? I think we got it written.
Okay, we'll save that. We'll save that.
Yeah, we have a bunch of food fight references. And kind of, our food is flying everywhere.
Okay, so we'll turn it over to Michal now to talk Arthurian connections.
Yeah, so this is the first story where the Arthurian legends kind of start to play a role in the Witcher universe. By the end of the series, they will be hugely important, kind of more important than I think even you would anticipate knowing that. So to me, the connections here are pretty strong to the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which comes from the mid-14th century. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know exactly what it's based on. It kind of combines a bunch of different lore and things like that, but it is one of the most famous surviving Arthurian stories. So to me, this has a couple of references. Briefly, the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight starts when a Green Knight shows up at Arthur's court and challenges anyone in the court to chop off his head and then basically go back to the Green Knight in a year and submit to the same challenge. So he will have his own head cut off in a year and a day. And nobody really steps up except Gawain, and Gawain chops off his head, and then he's like, cool, see? And the Green Knight picks his head off the floor and leaves and says, I'll see you in a year and a day. So in a year and a day, Gawain heads off on a journey to seek the Green Knight. He has a lot of trials, and one of those trials is a woman, and I believe he sleeps in her bower, and she basically keeps trying to seduce him, and he resists that. And I believe the woman turns out to be the Green Knight's lady, his wife, in the end. I might be getting some different versions mixed up here, so if I'm completely wrong, I apologize. But basically, he asks for a sash, the sash that the lady wears, her girdle, as kind of a representation of his passing of this. So to quote, I hold thee here absolved. That's of almost living with my wife, and purge as clean this morn as thou hadst ne'er done wrong since the day thou wert born. This girdle hemmed with gold, Sir Knight, I give to thee. 'Tis green as this my robe, as thou right well mayst see. And then at the end of the Witcher story, Geralt asks Calanthe, he says, I ask for your green sash, Calanthe. May it always remind me of the color of your eyes and the most beautiful queen I have ever known. And Calanthe gives him her necklace, her emerald necklace instead. And then later in the Green Knight, at the very end, the Knights of the Round Table all take the green sash as their kind of mark to kind of honor Gawain and his stalwartness, his truth. So to me, I really see Geralt as the Gawain figure and Dooney as the Green Knight figure in this story. It's not at all a perfect matchup, by any means, but it is, you do have kind of the knight who is called to fight, and you do have the intruder who is, throwing down a challenge. They obviously end up fighting on the same side, but it does, in the end of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there definitely is like parity between them. And one of Junia's last speeches is very much like, oh, I was so wrong. I totally misjudged you, dude. And, so yeah, I think this is a really interesting way to introduce the idea of Arthurian legend, which are also very deeply bound in destiny with, with Arthur's death and, Mordred and all of these different factors. So yeah, that's what I have to say about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
One really interesting thing too to note, we sometimes sprinkle in book to show stuff. One thing that is different is we do see a different looking Calanthe, in the show, in the books. She is described as having ashen hair in this chapter, so there's a clear reference between Pavetta and Calanthe looking very similarly. But if you look in the show, if you look at Pavetta's dress, it's a turquoisey green. And I think that visual cues are obviously very important. There's a few things that I was talking with Michal and Aziz privately. We'll talk more about this actually in our spoiler episode on Friday, but where Pavetta and Duny get married, there's the conjunction of spheres, and they're right in the middle of the conjunction of spheres. So there's clearly signaling. There's color schemes that are used. I talked about this when I covered Westworld. Some of these things are important and are a little bit spoilery, but I think in connection to the whole green sash stuff and Pavetta and her having a green sphere around her and being connected to elder blood and elves and all that. So there's all sorts of connections and visual cues and when the author uses specific colors and stuff like that I think are important specifically to some of the bigger bombshells that actually happen later in the story. So I found that a little bit interesting. And if you guys go back and watch the episode, I just watched it back the other night, you'll notice that there's a few changes from the book to the show with, what they're wearing and stuff like that, which I have no problem with.
One major advantage that this story has that the show changed is that there's no dead baby in this story.
That is nice, isn't it? Yes.
Yennefer and the Queen and the dead baby is not my favorite. I found that very disturbing. And
yeah, you don't usually see a dead baby on TV. That is extremely rare.
No, it really goes the opposite way because she's out of the water and it's like, oh, we're gonna think the child's dead and then it's gonna live, and then nope, it's like literally dead. It's
pale white, like that is a dead baby. Wow.
It's nice that we don't have to discuss this with how much shit is hitting the fan. So a little bit less crap to have to absorb emotionally.
So another like visual cue that's interesting is I don't mind this change, but in the books, Ciri, Pavetta, and Calanthe all have the same eye color and hair color, which is ash gray hair and green eyes. But in the show, Calanthe has dark hair, and that's visually representative of the elder blood gene skipping her. So it works as a change because of it distinguishes her in that sense. It wasn't necessary to do that, but it does have that effect, and that works for me.
And we agree that Jodie May absolutely knocked the portrayal of
absolutely that's the most important part. The fact that she just was absolutely nailed it. And if for anyone who isn't aware, she was Maggie the Frog on Game of Thrones, which is another connection to Cersei indirectly, so that's pretty neat.
Turned out to be so important, didn't it?
It's really
sorry
crazy.
That's all the Game of Thrones shade I'll throw this episode.
So like Aziz, like there is like literally, I don't know, 30, 40 references like that we could talk about in Calanthe and Cersei that like just so many similarities. We got the lion cub of Cintra, Tommen being a lion cub, like all of these different things, you know what I mean?
Well, Queen Elizabeth called herself the lion's cub when she, as King Henry VIII was, I mean, that's a gross mischaracterization to call him any kind of lion, but royal propaganda, etc.
and the Cintrans being kind of like the Lannisters or, like the royals in England. So there's a lot of similarities there that are sprinkled in all these influences.
So shall we talk about some characters? We've covered most of the characters kind of just throughout by discussing them and including the characterizations in our discussion of other things. But real quick, we could point out a few other things about these characters that we may have missed. We may as well stick with Calanthe beginning here. I really like, one thing I really liked was Geralt's observation of her, quote, arsenal of smiles.
Yes.
That was really cool.
Such a great line.
I pulled a quote here that I appreciate that comes up from that, if you don't mind, Michal.
Yeah. I've become convinced that the witcher's profession is worthy of respect. You protect us not only from the evil lurking in the darkness, but also from that which lies within ourselves. It's a shame there are so few of you. Calanthe smiled. For the first time that night, Geralt was inclined to believe it was genuine.
Yeah, that last bit about, but also from that which lies within ourselves, that's a really powerful line, because that is what Geralt was after. The whole time Geralt was trying to avoid bloodshed. He was trying to stop. He was doing the opposite of what Calanthe hired him for. She wanted him to kill, and he decided to do everything he could to avoid killing, except for, well, he had to kill some guards.
They're very just like, oh, well.
And he only killed the ones who were about to kill Dooney. So he didn't. It's funny how everyone was either trying to kill Dooney or trying to not be killed, because no one wanted to take on Iced. No one wanted to take on Geralt. And as far as like crack on crate, people were just trying to stop him. Like Kudgudak didn't hack him. He just kicked a chair into his, like, knocked him over. You know, they're like, it was all like, well, we don't really want to kill each other, but we got to stop this somehow. So
the skeletons remind me of Tormund.
Yeah, they've got some. Yeah, they're like late medieval period Vikings, whereas like the Ironborn in Game of Thrones are early medieval, where they're not as cultured. They haven't advanced very far as a society, and they're still very portrayed. It's not always accurate to portray them as, you know, just dirty and because in fact there's evidence that they washed more than other Europeans, but still
they haven't learned about Christianity either, I don't think.
Right, that was the big thing that changed them, was the gaining Western, or not Western, but Christian religion, and that changed their culture. But that's part of where this is obviously the influence is from. But we'll save the bulk of that.
The heavily Scott.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Good
point. Yeah, especially with some of the names, like Drag Bondu is a very that's not a Norse name. There's a little bit of a clue to Calanthe's youth. When it becomes clear that Pavetta is pregnant, Mousesack says, "Today's youth," muttered Mousesack. "The apple doesn't fall far." And Clint says, "What's that?" And he's like, "Oh, nothing." Mousesack obviously is much older and has been around. So he was an adult before Calanthe was even born, because these mages live forever. Not literally.
Druid, but... him and his druidy ways.
Yeah. So you pulled an amazing quote here too, Michal, that I'll turn it over to you now.
I referenced this earlier, but it's really worth saying again because it's so amazing. So when Geralt says, "Aha, so I, a poor witcher, am to face down a destiny which is stronger than the royal will. A witcher fighting destiny. What irony."
Yes, Geralt, what irony?
Never mind, Your Majesty. It seems the service you demand borders on the impossible. If it bordered on the impossible, Calanthe drawled, I would manage it myself. I wouldn't need the famous Geralt of Rivia. And like, it's
wait, hold on. Will you say that last line again? You said borders on the impossible, just for the pod.
Oh, if it bordered on the possible, Calanthe drawled, I would manage it myself. I wouldn't need the famous Geralt of Rivia.
That's such a great line.
And she has the strength to back it up. Like when they start singing that song about her, and she's just like, "Oh yeah, that was the time 3,000 people died because I wanted to protect my financial interests," you know. And it's just like she is, again, not a good person, but a really effective leader. And knows what she wants and kind of does what she needs to get that, and isn't like, it could be very cowing to be forced into this role, which I think is maybe something we could talk about Pavetta, because we really don't know much about Pavetta or how she feels about all this, other than like she's in love with Dooney, the end. But Calanthe is so larger than life. Like, to me, she's one of those characters that just like stands out as a giant in the whole series.
In our shared document, Michal put, Queen.
Yeah.
You can put like little sidebars just for behind the scenes look, everyone. And when I saw that, I was just like reading through, because we all read through each other's stuff, because we all have specific things that we want to talk about. And I literally spit out my water. I was like, oh my God.
I also called Calanthe head bitch in charge. Fuck your patriarchal standards. Also, fuck anyone who doesn't give me what I want. No, I'm not nice. What are you going to do about it?
That's why we love you, Michal.
Nice.
Also, people are making fun of my Canadian accent when I say Michal.
So just a quick couple of words about a few other characters. We mostly talked about Iced, but I just want to point out a few like character details of him. He's the brother of the King Bran. Hey, King Bran. And
well, Bran means king, so
yeah, there you go, King. And he's also the.
George R. R. Martin is like that gif of like from Arrested Development, like the drunk wink, like. Yeah.
He's the uncle to Kraken Crate, and he's also the Jarl of Skellige, which is one of those words that has multiple meanings. When Jarl Kraken Crate, he has the title Jarl because he's a chieftain, it's a title for that basically means clan leader or chief leader, or chieftain rather. Whereas the Jarl of Skellige, as an official title, means the commander of the armed forces of Skellige. They have a united like a first kind of a head general, and that's him. So basically when the Skellige armies are called, the vassals are called, the banners are called, whatever term you want to use, he manages that and runs it. He's in charge of the armies under the authority of the king. So it's a part of why everyone's so afraid of him, and part of why he has so much authority is, well, he has a lot of authority. It's not it's very straightforward. Kudak, we talked a good bit about him, but the important thing here is the connection to the Cinderella stories. Now, as I mentioned during the Cinderella influences, a common recurring theme is talking animals. So Kudak is the inversion of that. Instead of having talking animals or animals that talk like people, he is a person that talks like animals. And Kyle, you had a take on that, a catch with regards to the fact that people were acting like animals, right?
Well, it's interesting because like I think it was like the second paragraph of the chapter, Geralt's taking the bath and then they shave him. They have the whole shaving thing. And then Geralt gets out and like if you've ever had a dog, people in chat, like a dog gets out of the bathtub and like you try to dry them off inside the bathtub and then they shake and they just get you wet no matter what. That's kind of what Geralt does. But throughout the chapter, we see more and more people like Kudak is observing people and he says, the feast is more akin to a zoo than an inn. So it's kind of like a little rhyme, you know what I mean? And I thought that was kind of cool, fun little catch. And me and Aziz and Michal had went back and read the chapter again, and they're like, oh yeah. Like after we had mentioned that, like people are kind of, crack on, like as people are drinking more and their inhibitions are, kind of coming out, people are acting more animalistic and letting the mammal side of them come out a little bit more at the feast.
Right on.
So that was pretty cool.
That's probably all I had to say about characters. I'll say some more about Mousesack, but I'll save him for when we talk about some of the magic stuff because that's more directly related to him. Should we get into lore? We've covered some of it already, but we could get deep into the Law of Surprise and some of the other.
We haven't really. We've talked a little bit about that, but I think we should probably like explain how we perceive it and then how it applies to the story, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
Real quick first, the elder blood is what's going on with is the gene or / whatever genetic word you want to use to discuss to point out what's happening with Calanthe, or not Calanthe, but Pavetta and then Ciri. It's called the elder blood or Hen Aker, and there's not a lot we can say about it without spoilers, but just to say that there is a lot more on it. It's a very important thing.
100% going to be chatting about that next Friday. That will be a big topic.
So when we do our spoiler episode, good point, Kyle. When we do our spoiler episode, we'll go a little deeper with that. All right, so Michal, right? You're going to take us away on the Law of Surprise and its real world origins, right?
Yeah,
real world.
This is really cool.
Sort of, yeah.
So just to do a nice quote, because this actually really does sum it up very nicely. This is from Kudak, who says something smart. Good for you. Let us not pretend we have never heard of such requests of the Law of Surprise as old as humanity itself, of the price a man of the price a man who saves another can demand, of the granting of a seemingly impossible wish. You will give me the first thing that comes to greet you. It might be a dog, you'll say, or a halberdier at the gate, even a mother-in-law impatient to holler at her son-in-law when she returns home, even a mother-in-law impatient to holler at her son-in-law when he returns home. Or you'll give me what you find at home you don't yet expect. After a long journey, honorable gentlemen, and an unexpected return, this could be a lover in the wife's bed, but sometimes it's a child marked out by destiny. So that the law of surprise basically promises ownership of something you already have but don't know about. It's a gamble. It's a dice with destiny. Anything could happen. It could literally be nothing. It could be like, oh, my wife just swept the floor. Like, here's a pile of dirt she just swept outside. Or it could be, the wife herself or a child or anything.
It's funny that they mention animal too, right? Because they mention it could, and then we have more animal references. Sorry.
Right, exactly. So a child of surprise is one of the children who is referred to by the law of surprise. And these children are regarded as selected by destiny. And throughout history, there are a bunch of examples in the story, like Mad Day is saved by, I didn't write down all the references, but there's quite a few of them. So people in this world definitely regard this as being a real concept. Obviously for Geralt, this has a very personal reference because he himself was a child of surprise, and that seems to be how Witchers are sourced, I guess you could say, because they tend to be born under the shadow of destiny. So his idea is that he will continue this tradition. He says, in order to become a Witcher, you have to be born in the shadow of destiny, and very few are born like that. That's why there are so few of us. We're growing old, dying, without anyone to pass our knowledge, our gifts onto. We lack successors, and this world is full of evil, which waits for the day none of us are left. So he basically plans to continue, not only that tradition, but also the tradition of that Junie has begun with Rognar, referring to Pavetta. In the real world, I've never heard of this in this form. And I think it's actually such a cool concept because I love the idea of magical contracts, and it's just very clever. I really like it. But the parallel that I did find is a biblical story of Jephthah, which is how I'm going to say it. I'm actually more familiar with the Old Testament, so in my parlance, it's Yiftach, who basically vows to God that he will sacrifice the first thing he sees that comes out of his house when he comes home, if he comes home safely from war. And his daughter comes out to greet him because she's so thrilled that he is alive. This is a very dark version of the child surprise, and something that I think kind of plays into the idea that, like, this is not necessarily good for the child. If you've read the story, like, Ciri has a really rough time of it through being a child surprise and a child of destiny. Calanthe mentions that, obviously Calanthe wants Veta for her own interests also, but she says that Rognar only told her when he was dying because he knew what a mother whose child is disposed of so recklessly is capable of. Mm-hmm. And to me, that ties in. Like, can you imagine, like, Jephthah, like, telling his wife, like, okay, I have to sacrifice our daughter now.
Excuse me? What did you agree to?
Didn't you mention a reference to Agamemnon and what happened in Troy?
So that's interesting because that's a little bit, that's more like Jephthah than it is like, as I understand it, there are a lot of different versions of the stories, but it's more like Jephthah than it is like the Law of Surprise because Agamemnon basically kills, I think, one of Artemis's sacred deer or something, and she basically holds back the winds so they can't go to Troy, sail to Troy to begin the Trojan War that ends really well for them. And then she tells him basically he has to sacrifice his daughter in order to provoke the winds, which either he does or he dedicates her to the goddess, or depending on which version you read. But yeah, so there's kind of like a trail there. I don't know if there is like a, first thing you see when you come out of your house or when you come home story in Greek mythology. I wouldn't be shocked at all, or in some other mythology, but that's the only one that I could find.
And of course, Agamemnon, when he finally returns from the Trojan War, 20 years later or whatever, his wife kills him.
Right.
For what she.
And then that's a whole thing.
Yeah. It's like, you did what? You sacrificed / gave away whatever. Yeah, like, no.
A very Stannis-y, Shireen-y thing that, people.
Oh yeah, Stannis is Agamemnon for sure.
Oh,
yeah. Well, I mean, it is, if you're talking about like strictly the Witcher thing, this is kind of, those are supposed to be boys, but like, what is it? Like 3 out of 10,
Survive the trial of grasses.
Yeah, exactly. So it sort of is a death sentence if you give your child up to be made a Witcher. So
Yormi in the chat, Yormingan says it's very Spartan-esque because they had a culture of males, right? They would discard babies that weren't of the recommended size, their kind of template for warriors, right? So that is something that's really interesting too, which Spartan and Greeks were, they're side by side there. So that's kind of interesting too. And thank you for that, Yormi, in the chat. By the way, before we continue, everyone that's joining us today, we hope you're still having fun. We got a little bit more to talk about, and we just thank you for hanging out with us today. It's been really fun so far.
Looks like Macrophag says it's huge in Eastern European fairy tales. Like half of the stories have law of surprise in them. So
really?
Yeah. So that's a great take or really interesting or really informative and part of the reason we do these live so we can get takes like that from knowledgeable participants like Macrophage and Jormungandr.
Because the princess is
giving us advice.
The princess is such an important archetype in these stories, right?
Yeah.
And this is kind of what's driving it too. We see, Ciri and all that later. She's a princess, so we can't deny that.
And there's it's a similar theme to the idea of giving your kids away for political marriages. It's like it's a promise to give your child away. It's not necessarily magical in the real. Well, it's not magical in the real world, though. It certainly can carry grave social consequences if you break the promise, if not like causing war over, like breaking of honor and contracts in that sense. If the person is powerful enough to take revenge or make you accountable through violence.
It's often why people had wards like Ned Stark with Theon, because they know they could
keep them behaved.
So they knew they could have that person as collateral as a way for them to not kind of as a warning to not be aggressive and not make any further advances in war or in politics and stuff like that, kind of as almost like a barrier.
Yeah, and medieval society also relied a lot on boys being, and I guess maybe to some extent girls, but like being given to the church as, partly it was a way so their parents didn't have to feed them. But also, it was part of, promoting that society also, that like, you have enough children and you give 1 or 2 to God, which is actually something we see in the Song of Ice and Fire too.
We saw a little bit of that in Grain of Truth, actually, where people are giving their kids to Nivellen. Right, and they're kind of
very true. Yeah, you're right. To help the family, like, well, you go live with him. We'll get rich, and the whole family will be better for it. Yeah.
By the way, none of this is recommended. This is not an endorsement of giving you children.
Do not do this.
The podcast of surprise does not endorse.
Will not end well.
So I have a question to throw out to y'all. This is something that I'm a little not confused about, but uncertain about. I wonder if Geralt just makes up the girl must consent part as an effort to try to make this all happen, because we don't really see evidence of that later necessarily. Like in his own case, he says that he expresses bitterness not much later, but later, that he never had a choice, that he was made a Witcher and he never had a say in it. So there was no consent from him. So I wonder, that's part of where I'm coming from, is if he expected that Urchin and the others wouldn't know how the law of surprise works, because that's what happens. He brings this up and they're like, well, who are you to say that? Because who are you to know so much about the law of surprise? And that's when Mousak jumps in and says, well, he would know because he is a child of surprise himself. So either Mousak is backing his lie or he doesn't know either. And so it's confusing because I'm not sure Mousesack would back that lie, but he also wouldn't get it wrong. I think Mousesack would understand the law of surprise even better than Geralt would possibly, but maybe not because Geralt, since he lived through it. So that's where a lot of this confusion is. So let me throw it over to you guys and see what you think.
So here's my perspective on it. We saw how Geralt treated Renfrey, right? Geralt is a great observer. And I think a few people have mentioned in chat that he's a great detective. He was monitoring everyone's behavior. He listened to Calanthe's words very closely. And he's basically like, yeah, I'm not going to do this for you. This is how Witchers work. So I think that because of the experiences that Geralt has had throughout his life, he's sympathetic to a lot of different people because he sees how people are treated, right? He knows that humans can be the worst kind of monsters, that he's been treated like a monster. So I think that, I mean, just look at Pavetta's body language. She could barely raise her eyes. That's one thing that Sapkowski really highlights in this chapter, right? And look at the aggressiveness of Calanthe. Like, Geralt is like trying to fend her off. You know what I mean? He's like trying to dodge and weave her as much as possible. But, and this is for you guys too, and everyone in the chat. Do you think that Geralt noticed how Pavetta might have felt in this situation? I think that was maybe a factor that wasn't really highlighted by Sapkowski, but as a viewer and as of the show, and also people that are reading the books, that's kind of how I feel about it, and that Geralt is a little bit sympathetic. I mean, you can clearly see that Pavetta doesn't want to be married to Crack-on Crate or any of these other people.
Yeah. Michal, what do you think about it?
You know, that had never occurred to me. It kind of, yeah, that's really interesting. It kind of reminds me of when we were wondering if Stregobor was totally full of it last time. I mean, he was full of it anyway, but I don't know. That is actually,
it's a cool lie. Like, just like you said, it's still like, it doesn't change the like feminist take on it, because if Geralt is trying to like make people understand consent, then it's the same thing. It's not coded into the magic would be the difference. But
and I mean, they do note that what breaks the curse is not Calanthe, is not Pavetta saying yes. It's Calanthe saying yes, which is very, you know, this is something that, I mean, I'm sure Mr. Sapkowski would probably be like, make up your own damn mind. But this is like the level of question that I would be very interested to ask him.
Well, look at the level, look at the things that we considered in the lesser, like we covered the lesser evil last time. Geralt is considering Renfrey's level of consent in all of the events. So this is the preceding story, and I think that, I mean, that's part of the reason Geralt was so fiercely defending her body, right? Like, despite all of the things that happened and despite her decisions, like, they may have not turned out in, like, being perceived as good, but I think that Geralt did feel sympathetic about that, and that could, and I find it really interesting that this is the next story that we're covering, right? Like, so if we're chronologically, you know, the timeline is messed up, but let's consider that this is right after this, and some time has passed, and Geralt's had time to think about this. This would certainly be something that Geralt would consider, you know, I think. So that's kind of how I look at it, and that Geralt has seen other situations where people haven't had consent. Like, Renfrey was hunted down, you know what I mean? And this is a different situation, but Renfrey didn't have a lot of consent in these situations. She was being more reactionary, you know? It's like she was trying to survive, so.
Yeah. That's a good, really good take, guys. It's a good question, a good open question, perhaps. And I think, Michal, your take saying, well, maybe it's Sapkowski's left it for the reader to decide is, I think I lean that way. But maybe we'll discover new details as we read forward. Maybe we'll get some more something that maybe changes the picture a little. So I noticed something that I accidentally skipped over that was reminded to us by, but yeah, exactly. One of who just mentioned that in the chat here. Mora mentioned Rumpelstiltskin, and there's the mention of Rumpelstelt in this tale. It's very brief, and that's just a kind of a nod. But there is another story, and I was really hoping to get takes from maybe someone in the chat recognizes this one. Geralt mentions a quote. He says, there's a well-known song out of, well, actually, it's he recognizes the musicians playing this. Same difference. Well-known song out of time about a little goat with horns, a goat with little horns, rather, and a vengeful old woman with no sense of humor. That's got to be a reference to some fairy tale or classic story that I don't know what it is.
When I thought goat with old horns, I thought a little bit of Torque.
Ah, yeah, right.
Kind of a
But
little
this
bit
is
of
a small
foreshadowing.
goat, almost like a baby goat.
Yeah.
The
It
only
sounds
thing I
like
can
a
think of is
cuckolding type of thing.
with horns.
Yeah.
Ooh.
But I don't know why the
Ooh.
woman would have no sense of humor. Usually it's like the joke is on the man in that case. Unless I don't know. I'm I'm thinking about how this could
Does
play
Yennefer
out.
have a sense of humor? Lol. Sorry.
No, Yennefer has no sense of humor.
She has
I'm
very
not-
little sense of humor.
Yeah,
Love my girl. No
I-
sense of humor.
I don't know if that's foreshadowing. I'm just being an idiot.
So I guess, well, if anyone in the chat knows, they'll speak up. But so far, nobody knows what that story is a reference to. Maybe one day we'll figure it out. But right now, it's a mystery.
Yeah.
So,
I do just want to add in terms of things we don't really fully understand is Geralt's sigil, which is extremely specific.
Yeah.
It's a bear passant sable, which we looked it up, means a bear like walking, and sable means black. Damsel vested azure, so a girl wearing blue, riding him, her hair loose and her arms raised. So the only thing I can think of is Ciri. But like I don't know. Geralt's not a bear. He's not connected to bear imagery. I don't get it.
You know what's funny?
It's repeated multiple times. So I was just like, all right, let's just bring this up in case someone knows what it is.
we were talking about this one privately. We're like, how do we read this? Like, it's pretty tricky. And then we were all like reading it out loud to each other. And then finally, I think I was like, oh, okay, this is how it happens. And then we were like, oh, this is how you read it. Because it's like worded weirdly, right? It's like
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, heraldic language is very specific and very not consistent with the way we talk nowadays.
So that was a bit. I think that was a bit confusing. Someone else had mentioned that to me. They're like,
it's probably French. It's probably like translated directly from French or something. So it's like.
Je parle français.
Ha ha ha.
We
still got magic, right, Aziz?
We do. We have a little bit of lore here. I saved talking about Mousak for this kind of combine the topics, and then we have a little bit of herb lore, and then we'll do our funniest moments. So yeah, let's talk about our first druid that we meet. There's not a lot of difference between druid and sorcerer. In fact, Calanthe even calls Mousak sorcerer kind of offhand. It mostly is a cultural personality difference in what they seem to be interested in, because druids are more attuned and concerned with nature, mages with politics and power, things like that. So, but as far as the actual magic they can wield, just like any magic user, they just seem to fall into, they're good at certain things and not other. Like Stregobor is really good with illusions, and what's her name? I'm spacing out on her name. It doesn't matter. There's lots of characters that have specialties. Like Triss is more towards the druid side. She has a lot of the nature-y magic, maybe, but she doesn't call herself a druid. But still, there's a lot of your talent, the type of magical talent within certain categories sort of determines your outlook, but also your personality. So I don't think there's a lot of differences in the actual like source of power they're tapping into. Arguably the priests are tapping into the same source of power that the mages and druids are, but they call it the gods, but no one actually knows where it's coming from. So that's a whole nother topic. But Mousak, of course, comes from Skellige and decides to stay now that he's discovered what's going on with Pavette. He's like, this girl needs some help, and
he's gonna play Merlin to
yeah,
he is
Merlin sack. So one little bit that ties into another use of curses comes up here. He says, well, let's look at the quote here, Michal.
Yeah. This is with magic, by the way. They both hit her simultaneously, Geralt with the sign of Ard, and Mousak with a terrible 3-staged curse, powerful enough to make the floor melt. The chair on which the princess was standing disintegrated into splinters. Pavetta barely noticed. She hung in the air within a transparent green sphere. Without ceasing to shout, she turned her head towards them, and her petite face shrunk into a sinister grimace. Which is quite evocative. And also where they get like Ciri's power of Screamo, to quote honest trailers.
She went Dark Phoenix there.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. She was like, that doesn't bother me. What do I need a chair for? And then afterwards, we see a little more of his capabilities when they're like, Rain, this guy needs a doctor. And Mousek's like pulls out his wand and is like, well, I call for a doctor.
Yeah.
Like, I'm right here.
A hawthorn wand with a rat skull on it. It's really cool.
That is really cool, and it's the second appearance of Hawthorne,
Yeah.
which is we see that in the first story. It's in the elixir that he drinks before he fights the Striga. So that's neat to see that again. Another open question. This is one for everyone. Michal, will you read the quote, and then I'll ask the question?
Yeah. There on the oak table, crumbs, grains of buckwheat, and fragments of lobster shell were moving like ants. They were forming runes which joined up for a moment into a word, a question.
So this is Mousak surreptitiously communicating with Geralt while he's talking to Calanthe, and Mousek's trying to figure out what's going on. They both feel the magic in the room, and they're like, what is going on here? So what is this word? He asks Geralt, and I'm curious both what the chatters think and what you guys think.
I think it's just like, you good?
you good, bruh? You good, bruh?
Which is 2 words, but you know.
Something like you good, bruh?
Yeah, right. Or like safe word.
Yeah, safe word. I thought maybe it would be spurge.
Oh God. We had to give Aziz another opportunity to use that word.
I'm segueing into the herb lore, so
Okay.
I had to get that in there.
Found some
But yeah,
stuff
I
about
really don't
Angelica,
know.
too. And Primrose.
Yeah, Angelica and Primrose are the big ones here. I really don't know though. I don't know what the question is. Something about like, do you sense that? But it's one word. So like, what one word would get that point across?
Yeah, now I'm imagining just like the question mark emoji. So just like
yeah, yeah. It's a question mark word. Like,
Yormi says ultra combo. That's kind of funny.
Yeah, the ultra combo for the magic sign of art and the 3-stage curse, and then it needed a soundtrack to work with the eventual Kudak got in there with the soundtrack. So I guess we just don't have an answer, but I love it. It's an open question for the fandom. Like it's not as big a question as what we'll have in the Last Wish when what is Geralt? What was the last wish? That's a great open question. That's a bit bigger of a question. So let's talk about the herbs. We mentioned Hawthorn. That's Mousek's wand, has a rat skull on the front, which is, that does seem more nature-y, but I guess we talked about that. But here's the big one, the really big, sneaky, symbolic reference. Started off with a quote again.
Let me just find out who let him into the castle at night. Let me at the ladies-in-waiting you went gathering primroses with. Primroses, damn it. Well, what am I to do with you now?
First of all, let me point to Calanthe's acting here, because she almost certainly knew that this was happening. She knew about Dooney, obviously, because her husband Rogner told her. But in Sapkowski's extra writing, which includes he wrote several of the genealogy histories of some of the major families, he indicated that Calanthe knew that Pavetta was meeting with somebody or sneaking off. I don't think she knew who it was. She may not have pieced it all together and realized it was the same person that was coming to collect the Law of Surprise. But anyway, the point here isn't that.
Can have known that, or can't have put that together, because she seems very. I mean, why would you do this whole thing?
But Rogner did tell her on the deathbed, right? Like she knew about that specifically, right?
Well, she knew about the surprise, but not necessarily about that Pavetta was sneaking out to meet with Dooney. Yeah. She may have only known he was sneaking out and not known who, or just not at all. Maybe Sapkowski counteracted himself a bit there. I'm not sure. But anyway, I wanted to point that out. The main point is the primroses themselves. That is an incredible symbolic resonance for Pavetta herself. They're big in Shakespeare. Think of Primrose Everdeen, Katniss's younger sister in Hunger Games. The primroses are often, there's a few different goddesses of love from different pantheons that primroses are sacred to, but mostly it's a symbol of youth, femininity, and specifically young and naive love, which is a bullseye here for Pavetta, because obviously it's the first person she falls in love with, and it's a bit naive to, you know, she's supposed to marry a king or something, or a lord or something like that. So it's you can see how that fits really well. It also symbolizes internal transition, which for her, I mean, hell, she just exploded with all this power that she probably barely knew she had, if at all. Another symbol is understanding and composing your inner self, which again fits extremely well. That's why Mouse Sack is going to stay to help her, for example.
Also,
and
pregnancy.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's a good call. Eating it can help you get it was said to have some the ability to transport you to get advice from a fairy, which is part of the recurring fairy godmother theme. It taps into that with the Cinderella influence. Primroses physically have what is described as an eye in the center of the petals. They're called it's called an eye, which is really cool because of Pavetta's eyes are stunning and an indication of the magic, the elder blood that's in her.
Also, the conjunction of spheres and the sphere that she is within and transmutes.
Perfect. Yeah, you're right. That's a great call. And the primrose is the first flower that blooms after frost and snow. It's the first one to kind of get going, which also has a little bit of a nod to some of the prophecies that we haven't really discussed yet, but it certainly fits. And so that's a lot, right? That's a big deal. And that's why I brought up Primrose Everdeen from Hunger Games, because she's also kind of symbolic of a lot of those things. Katniss is very protective of her and sees her as the future of their family and just the future in general. She's a symbol of that. So that's just really neat. I caught this. That's the piece I caught at like 3 a.m. last night when I was doing a last minute looking around. I was like, oh man, I'm glad we didn't miss this one.
Aziz messaged us this morning. He's like, I found some more Primrose evidence. Aziz gets so, I'm like, oh, and then me and Michal are like, oh, Aziz and your gardening, we love you. Because he is gardening, he's looking for answers. So.
Yeah, right. So a much shorter connection here is with Angelica. It's mentioned very briefly, which Geralt wipes his face with a tincture of Angelica when he's getting out of the bath. And Angelica has the symbolism around it.
Tone after you.
Yeah. Exactly. It has less on point symbolism here, but it does have some it's associated with sun and fire and potency and energy like that, which that maybe applies to Geralt somewhat, maybe more to Calanthe, but it's known to be protective of women. And so it's an herb or a thing associated with guarding or protecting women, which that's certainly a big part of this chapter as well. Geralt, trying to protect Pavetta, maybe even more so than Calanthe does, and but still, and just women's rights being pushed around, and the that whole the kind of perversion of men coming for young women and things like that. So that's definitely, I think, a back theme here.
And his medallion shimmers like the sun when magic in relation.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. His medallion is as prominent as it ever is in this story, for sure.
That's one thing that I was kind of missing a little bit from the show version, that I wish they would have kind of set up a little bit more, kind of like the tension between Mousak and Geralt, and maybe kind of the magic entering the room. Maybe they could have done like, when they do like scents, like weird scents in the air and stuff like that, they could have done a little bit of something like that, but not a big quip.
A couple of Macrophage and Jormungandr are talking about how, in the chat, yes, Sapkowski really does know his flowers. Jaskier means buttercup after all, or dandelion or whatever, and depending on how you look at it, I guess it's technically buttercup, but so that's so it really is just a lot of evidence here.
So we've exited the gardening section and we're entering the funniest moments. And I have to start off with this one because we were all having our private chat, our little meeting that we do before the podcast. And I'm like, there's like this Kud Kadak is hilarious. And he goes, "Brack, brack," roared Kud Kadak suddenly to loud applause. Geralt didn't know which animal he was imitating, but he didn't want to meet anything like it. And it's funny. It's funny because we don't really have a monster in this chapter, but we have Dooney, the Urcheon of Erlenwald, and it's just like super funny that this is mentioned. It's kind of a little bit of a jab, and Geralt not taking down any monsters really in the
Yeah,
chapter. So.
and it's like, what monster is he? Like, what animal is he afraid of? I mean, this is a dude who kills monsters for a living, so yet this is something he doesn't want to meet.
He's just like so bewildered by the sound. So I thought
Like,
that
oh
was
my
funny.
god. Everything else he's imitated sounded realistic. It's like, well, if those were realistic, well, what the hell is this one then? This must be real too. And damn.
Maybe it's a tripoded chicken thing.
Yeah, all the food references are hilarious. I can't remember which character does this, but when the guy takes the knife out of the lamb and he finds out that Pravetta is promised to Dooney, he's like super pissed. And Sapkowski is just like, and the man took a knife out of the lamb, like he was like going to just murder someone. He's like,
I think that was Rainfarn. Rainfarn was the most aggressive of all the, and he's not even a suitor. He was an escorting Windhelm of Atre, who was a 12-year-old. He was the suitor, and Windhelm I don't think speaks the entire chapter, but he does become a character later.
But I'm just picturing it in my head, like the person's expression on their face, and like I don't know if this ever happens in the show. It might be in the background or something. But I just found it so funny. That he was like ready to use the knife that was in the lamb to kill someone.
Yeah, I mean, on that same note, I think the physicality of this chapter plays really well into the humor. So we have this line where Krach and Crate, is kind of driving Ace crazy, and with all of his protestations and everything. So he growled, and Ace Tirsach meaningfully showed him a clenched fist. Krach growled even louder, and I'm just like, I can just picture that so well, just like
shaking his fist like, it's so old timey and funny, but it so fits Iced's personality because he's so
kind of like
good,
kind of like Kratos and Atreus from God of War.
And it's just like, it's very, like I imagine this culture just being like, you just beat each other up all the time.
How about that one? I wonder if anyone or anything can hold me back. Like, oh, come on, sit down, dude.
And he winds up on the table that's like spinning around.
Yeah, and they're trying to pull a plank off the table to use as a weapon. He's like, "I'm going to pull this table apart so I can hit you with it."
He tries to do that and fails, right? And then Ice just bashes a chair into pieces.
Yeah,
Ice actually hits someone in the show. He hits someone in the show version with the chair, and it breaks like in a cage match.
Pretty similar.
Yeah, it's like.
Yeah, I also just want to shout out Calanthe's line, "I ought to ask your forgiveness, but I hate doing that," because that is Queen.
And then that's followed up with this line: "Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you," smiled Dooney. "You're a wise and generous queen." "Of course I am. And beautiful."
Modesty.
Yeah. I love that. That reminds me of Monty Python, the Holy Grail, and it's like, "Arthur, you shall have a quest in these dark times." Like, "A quest? Great idea, oh Lord." Like, of course it's a good idea.
What about this quote? A roast pheasant with a few striped feathers stuck still in its rump fell from nowhere and thumped him in the back.
So random.
Well, okay, so less random, I think, is when an enormous head of carp splatters against Geralt's chest. And to me, if you've read further in the series, carp and fish and those things become emotionally significant, which sounds really weird to say, but like I'm just saying that carp is a way to Geralt's heart.
He loves fish.
I will say this chapter is really fishy.
Yeah, it's a couple of times that's come up, hasn't it?
No pirouettes, Michal.
No pirouette count still. That I might have been a little bit premature. I'm saying that should be a weekly count.
It gives us a reason to bring it up, though. He doesn't.
Yes.
No one fights him. He fights a few guards, but they don't really fight him. But he does block another object with his sword. That does every once in a while happen. It's not like a crossbow bolt this time, but it was a fork or something.
So right from mouth. I think that's it for today for the pod. I think we got everything.
Yeah,
I think so. I think that covered it. I don't think I have any points left other than our outro piece here.
So yeah, that's going to do it for the pod today. Of course, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. Maura Lee, I saw rejoined us. She said she was going to be back and forth with some appointments and stuff, but thank you for your donation. We also had another donation, Aziz, earlier. Amy Miller. It was, or I can't remember. Let me.
I can't scroll back up.
Yeah, I don't. My live chat is frozen on my desktop. So I'll just say this: thank you for all the donations, the generous donations, and also thank you to everyone who signed up on Anchor. Like we said earlier, the 4 of you that hit that support button. Aziz, you have the list right in front of you.
Yeah, Maura, Ryan B, Sam D, and James G. Thanks again, y'all.
So we really appreciate that. Of course, if you do want to support, hit that support button. We thank you for that. But if you want to support in other ways, give us a rating if you enjoy the podcast, and also review. It's like to think of it as like the like button and the subscribe button on YouTube. That's how you can help podcasts. It's a little bit different in how you can support podcasts, but if you want to do that, that's cool. If you're just down to enjoy it here as well, like and subscribe the channel. Also, you can find the links to Aziz and Michal's social media and their content creation. What's next for you, Michal?
Yeah, so I'm actually, my Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. podcast, which is called Level 7 Access, is in full swing because that final season of the show is on now. And I'm also writing reviews for the show at Hypeable. And I don't know, I have Vassals of Kingsgrave if you want like other stuff. We're also actually doing a Witcher read at the same time.
Cool.
So there's kind of, I'm like, which part of the story am I up to? You can follow me on Twitter also at InkAzrain. And Twitter is great. Twitter is wonderful, depending on the day.
It sure is good right now. It's not always good, but right now.
I logged off for a day and I was like, I literally missed major news. And I was like, oh my God.
On my end, we're working on A Feast for Crows with our Valar Rereadus efforts over in the History of Westeros channel. We're about to do the 3rd week of that, so we're still pretty early in the book. And we're always doing other stuff as well over there, so it pays to keep up with us and all our various projects. I'm most excited about what we're going to be doing next week. We're going to come back with the spoiler version of this episode. We're not going to repeat much. We're just going to, it'll be a shorter version because we don't have to set things up as much. We'll just talk about what plot points here connect to other plot points later, including early in the story all the way to the end of it. So there's a lot to say, and we're excited to do that. So, yeah.
Also, I was thinking, like, if people have any questions or like specific spoilery, particularly to do with this story that they want us to raise or talk about, that would be, great if they wanted to leave us that question.
Go to the Facebook group. And we have a podcast surprise Facebook group. Want to do a shout out for Ryan Burns and Lauren Spioni. They specifically, Ryan couldn't be here today. I know he's working and wanted to be here. He's one of our supporters too on Anchor. We are kind of discussing trying to maybe do a little bit later next week so Ryan and others can attend. We know people work during the day and stuff like that. But they had brought up some amazing points. We had done a poll and a couple of different threads. And that's some of the stuff that we're going to continue to do. We're going to try to talk a little bit more spoilers, in specific threads so people can avoid them if they don't want to do spoilers and stuff like that. But that's kind of some of the stuff that we're going to do on the group. So if you're interested in more Witcher discussions and what we're discussing on the podcast, A Surprise, make sure you check us out on Facebook. You can find that in the link in the description of the video if you want to come join our community. And oh my goodness, did we get another donation here?
Yeah, Maura,
keep some money for yourself.
Yeah, Maura.
Thank you very much, Maura. You're so generous. We love you. Also, I have to send you more cat pictures. I was going to do that anyway, but
we didn't.
A reminder.
I didn't. I was watching intently for Casanova and Xerxes, but I didn't see them today. But
yeah, I closed the door. They couldn't get in today, so.
So yeah, that's so again, once again, thank you. To all the people, Maura, Ryan B, Sam D, James D, Emily H. Like I said, make sure you check out Aziz's and Michal's links all in the description of the video. Subscribe and all of that. And next week, we are going to have our first spoiler episode, our first extra episode. We're going to talk about series lineage. We're going to talk about elder blood. We're going to talk about a big reveal in the Lady of the Lake. We're going to talk. It's going to be, I think, an hour. We'll probably maybe do an hour, something like that. 45 minutes to an hour.
Yeah.
See how it goes. Yeah.
But I think we're all in agreement. If you haven't read through the books, please don't spoil yourself, because
Don't.
guys, can't
Yeah.
say this any louder. Aziz,
Just definitely don't spoil yourself. Just wait for, if you haven't read all the books, just wait for our next regular episode on the Edge of the World, because that's also a really fun story, and it's a good bit different than the show's version. And it also sets up quite a bit for, not as much as the question of price, but it does have quite a lot of important world building and some important characters. So wait for that one rather than spoiling yourself, or better yet, just keep reading.
but
It's really worth preserving the surprise for yourself, because it's a really fun. It's a lot.
but
It's hard to say more than that, but
with that said, we
Right.
are listening and seeing what you guys are saying in the comments. Aziz and Michal have been gracious in opening up their schedules to do another one. We're more open to doing more stuff like this, an extra episode here and there. So, we all got the stuff going on, but we also all really love this and want to do more of it. So,
well,
and like I said, Michal said it great. If you guys have ideas, let us know in the comment section or join our Facebook page. Come chat with us. We see all the comments and stuff. We try to reply as much as we can, and we really appreciate everyone coming in today. So that's going to do it for today, everyone. Thank you, and we will see you all next Friday for this spoiler episode. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.